During a family vacation, my husband's parents insisted I sit at a separate table. No one spoke to me the entire trip. When I asked my husband, he shrugged. It's just their way. I smiled and said, perfect. I have my own way too. The next morning, they found out what I had done and panic set in. Hello, thank you for your support. This means a lot to us. We're on a journey to our first 100 subscribers. If you enjoy the stories we share, kindly subscribe to this channel. It will be great if you can leave a comment on which city you are watching from. We might just give you a shout out in our next story. Today's special shout out goes to Grace Barnes from California. We are glad you enjoy our stories. Now let's dive into the details of today's story. I knew something was off the moment we checked in. The receptionist asked if we'd like our rooms arranged the same way as last time. I turned to my husband, confused. Last time? He gave a small laugh and said, yeah, sure. I didn't press it, but the first cold hand curled around my spine. I stood there holding our passports while his parents wandered toward the bar, without even a glance at me. The receptionist smiled politely, too politely, and handed me a single key. No room number for me to match with his. No mention of my name. We walked into dinner like I was the help. His mother was already seated, meticulously rearranging silverware, and his father was speaking too loudly about something political. When I reached for a chair next to my husband, his mother looked up, blinked slowly and said, oh no, we've already got this table set. You're at the one over there. She pointed. A two-top in the corner, angled away from the sea view. I smiled the way women do when they're trying not to bleed in public, and walked to it. I sat alone for an hour, while they laughed over a bottle of wine I wasn't offered. That night I asked him, quietly, when we were finally alone, why he didn't say anything. Why didn't you speak up when she sent me away? He was brushing his teeth, spitting foam into the sink, like it wasn't even worth looking up for. It's just their way, he mumbled. Don't take it personally. They're old-fashioned. And I stood there barefoot in that tiled bathroom, staring at my own reflection behind his. I smiled. Perfect, I said. I have my own way too. I don't think he even heard me, but I heard myself, and it felt like steel behind my teeth. The next morning, they found what I'd done. I woke early, hours before breakfast, and walked down to the concierge. I smiled my warmest, asked about activity schedules, and made a few subtle changes. I canceled a private boat charter, told them the family had a change of heart. I rearranged spa times, so that his mother's session overlapped with a staff lunch. I accidentally left the balcony door open during a rainstorm, soaking the contents of her designer luggage. I left no fingerprints, just confusion. At breakfast, I returned to the same corner table, sipping coffee like a stranger. The tablecloth was damp beneath their folded arms. They were scrambling by the time my husband arrived, his mother pacing, his father on the phone with reception, demanding explanations. No one said good morning. No one looked at me. My husband sat down across from me, confused. What happened? He asked. I sipped my coffee. No idea, I said, watching his mother wave her hands in growing panic. Maybe it's just their way. He looked at me like I'd spoken in another language. Maybe I had. Maybe I was done translating myself for people who refused to learn me in the first place. The next few hours were a quiet unraveling. That afternoon I disappeared for a while. No note, no explanation. Just gone. I wandered the beach alone, barefoot and slow, collecting smooth rocks and the names of all the things I'd swallowed to stay palatable. Every smile I gave when I was talked over. Every meal I cooked without being thanked. Every time his mother called me that girl, and he didn't correct her. They taught me exactly how little I mattered, and I learned fast. I stayed out long enough to worry them, long enough to realize no one had called. When I returned, his mother was red-eyed and muttering about appearances. Dinner that night was more formal. Some local seafood place with lanterns and white tablecloths. They ordered a group meal again. Didn't ask what I liked. His father made a joke about how quiet I'd been. You're not usually this polite, he chuckled. I tilted my head and smiled. I'm listening, I said. And I was memorizing patterns, collecting ammunition. People tell you everything when they think you're too soft to use it. They drop comments, forgettable little things like his dad mentioning the offshore account, Or his mother laughing about writing someone out of her will. I was invisible, but they were transparent. That night in bed, he asked me if I was okay. Not because I looked upset, but because his mother had asked. That was the only time I saw concern flicker across his face. When her peace was threatened. "Are you mad at me?" he asked, brushing a hand across my thigh. I kissed his cheek. "Not at all," I whispered. "I just have a lot on my mind." He didn't know how much. He didn't know I'd already decided. That I was done trying to earn space in a family that treated me like furniture. That this wasn't a vacation. It was a lesson. And they were my final exam. I started doing the dishes after every group meal. Not because I was asked, but because it made me invisible. When your hands are submerged in soap and heat, people assume you're not listening. But I was. Every scrape of a fork against porcelain, every whispered complaint about service, every "she's just not really one of us, is she?" under their breath filed away. I moved through the house like a ghost. Replacing empty coffee pots before anyone noticed. Folding beach towels. Adjusting the blinds so the sunlight wouldn't fade their precious furniture. I made myself small, manageable, unthreatening. And they responded by shrinking me even more. It's funny how quickly silence becomes expected. By the third day, no one even looked up when I entered the room. They left me off the head count when organizing dinner. They passed menus around and skipped me. My husband would glance up occasionally, but never for long. I started testing it. Sitting down without saying a word. Standing behind someone for minutes, waiting to be acknowledged. Nothing. So I leaned into it. I took longer walks. I stopped offering help. I stopped laughing at his father's brittle jokes. I disappeared in plain sight. It was the most honest I'd ever been. I began to study them the way you study dangerous animals. Not with fear but with clarity. His mother was the epicenter. Controlling, performative, all soft cruelty masked by social grace. She praised strangers and punished blood. His father played the tired patriarch, but he was sharper than he let on. He watched everything and waited for people to fail him. And my husband, he was the quiet enabler, the bridge between cruelty and rationalization. He didn't strike. He abandoned. He retreated into neutrality like it was virtue. I used to think he was kind. But kindness without courage is just decoration. It's useless when the house is burning. That night, I listened through the bedroom wall as they talked about me. I had excused myself early, said I was tired, said I had a headache, whatever makes people comfortable with your absence. His mother's voice filtered through first. "She's not going to last," she said. "She's too sensitive. I can see it in the way she flinches." His father agreed, mumbled something about how I was probably after something, that I seemed too calculating to be real. Then the dagger. "You need someone stronger," she said to my husband. "Someone who doesn't sulk when they're not the center of attention." I didn't cry. I listened. I counted every word. By morning I was colder. Not in a vengeful way, not yet. But in a way that no longer sought approval. I watched them drink espresso and complain about the humidity like they hadn't tried to amputate my presence the night before. I buttered my toast. I folded my napkin. I started collecting keepsakes, not for sentiment but for evidence. Screenshots, voice memos, discarded receipts, emails left open on shared devices. If they were going to keep treating me like I didn't exist, then they wouldn't notice what I was carrying with me when I left. I stopped being part of their vacation. I started being part of my own exit. I told myself, don't fight them here. Let them believe they've won. Let them confuse your silence for defeat. They'd mistaken quiet for weakness their entire lives. Why stop now? My husband didn't notice how still I'd become, how far I'd pulled back. He still kissed my shoulder in the morning, still asked if I needed anything, still pretended nothing was happening. That kind of pretending is worse than hatred. Hatred at least tells the truth. But he wanted to believe we were fine, that I was just tired, just not used to the way things are. The worst part was, he almost convinced me. There was one moment that nearly broke me. His younger cousin, 17, braces quiet, sat with me one morning while everyone else was at a wine tasting. She looked at me like I was human. We sat on the porch and she asked if I was okay. I didn't know what to say. I told her I was just tired and she nodded. They do that, she whispered. They push people out. They make you feel like the outsider, even when you live here. I looked at her and realized this wasn't new. This wasn't about me. This was a pattern. A family ritual. And I was just this year's sacrifice. That night, I lay awake and mapped it all out. Not a revenge plan. Not yet. But an inventory. Of what they'd said. What they'd done. What they cared about most. They didn't fear conflict. They feared exposure. They feared embarrassment, judgment, anything that chipped their curated image. They fed on control. But control only works if everyone plays along. I stopped playing. I started thinking in terms of pressure points. Not to destroy, but to reveal. I wouldn't scream. I wouldn't beg. I would wait. And when the moment was right, I would make them see themselves, clearly publicly, without my voice ever needing to raise. I didn't notice it at first, the way my voice had shrunk. The way I started turning statements into questions, even in my head. I think I'm upset. Maybe I deserve this. I'd stand in the bathroom mirror rehearsing how to ask for things like dignity, like space, like a seat at a goddamn table. I used to be louder. I used to challenge things. But living inside that family was like living underwater. You learn to hold your breath longer each day, until silence feels like survival. Until you start to think you're difficult for needing air. There's a moment in every unraveling, where you realize you're not even angry anymore. Just done. That was me. On the 5th day of that vacation, I stopped crying in secret. Stopped writing unsent texts. Stopped giving him time to notice. I let the numbness wash over me like a second skin. I woke up and made coffee without offering to pour anyone else a cup. I took my breakfast on the beach alone, headphones in, eyes closed. I imagined vanishing entirely. I wasn't suicidal. Just exhausted. There's a difference people often miss. I didn't want to die. I just wanted them to stop mistaking me for someone who could be erased. I began to rebuild my voice in secret. Quietly. Slowly. I started journaling again, but not like before. Not feelings. Facts. A catalog of behavior. A record. Said I was dramatic when I asked why no one told me dinner was moved. Laughed when I asked if we could take a photo together. Used the word clingy when I tried to hold his hand. Every small cut had a timestamp now. I kept it all in a lock notes app under a different name, buried 3 folders deep. I called it the mirror. Because eventually I was going to hold it up to them and let them scream at their own reflections. Transformation doesn't come with fireworks. Comes with decision. Small, quiet decisions that rewire your spine. Mine started with therapy. Not the kind where you cry and someone nods. The kind where someone says, "That's emotional abuse." And you freeze because you've never heard it named out loud. I didn't tell anyone. I used work as a cover. Scheduled sessions during lunch. Cried in parking garages. Hid the tissue box. My therapist once asked, "What would happen if you stopped asking for permission to exist?" I didn't know how to answer. But I carried that question around like a pocket knife. I began separating the emotional from the practical. I made a new email. Got a post office box. I went paperless and rerouted all statements. I copied down account numbers. I started paying attention to laws, marital assets, digital trails, documentation protocols. Not because I wanted to leave yet, but because I wanted the option. That's the thing about control. Once someone hands it to you, you see how much you never had. I wanted to know I could disappear with the click of a button. That if they pushed me out again, this time I'd land on my feet. This time I'd be carrying fire. His mother asked me to fetch sunscreen for her one afternoon. Didn't say please. Didn't look up from her chaise. I went inside and stood in the bathroom, staring at the cabinet. Then I turned around and left it there. Walked straight past her with an empty glass in my hand. She didn't mention it. She just squinted and asked my husband to get it instead. He went without question. I realized in that moment, it wasn't personal. It was ritual. They weren't trying to hurt me specifically. They were just performing the same dance they'd always known. You either submit or you vanish. I chose something else entirely. I started watching old home videos on his laptop one night while he was asleep. I wanted to understand how deep the rot went. They used to be sweet once. Laughing. Dancing at some backyard barbecue. But even then I saw it. How his mother's smile dropped the second the camera turned away. How his father cut people off mid-sentence. How little girls were told to lower their voices and sit properly, while the boys threw rocks and shouted. These things start early. They settle in the bones. I realized I'd never stood a chance walking in with honesty and soft eyes. I was in a place where empathy was a weakness, not a currency. Eventually, I stopped trying to be palatable. I stopped shaving my legs. Stopped doing my hair the way he liked. Wore sunglasses indoors. Let my headphones speak for me. I wasn't trying to become cruel. I was becoming immune. There's a difference. Immunity looks like detachment. But it's really just focus. I was watching them now with the kind of clarity that comes from detachment. Like a scientist studying a virus under glass. I didn't want to kill it. I wanted to understand it. Because if I understood it, I could dismantle it. And if I dismantled it, maybe I could make sure no one else stepped into that house thinking they'd be safe. The invitation came in a pale ivory envelope, embossed with gold lettering, as if cruelty could be wrapped in elegance. Join us to celebrate 40 years of love and legacy. His parents' anniversary. An evening of speeches, catered delicacies, piano quartets. Formal attire required. I held the envelope in my hands and read it twice. I half expected it to be addressed only to him. But this time they remembered me. Maybe because appearances mattered now. Maybe because the venue had mirrors. I said yes without asking him. I marked the date and smiled. A celebration, yes. Just not the kind they were expecting. I started planning 2 weeks before the event. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that could be traced to malice. Just organization. I pulled up the guest list through a shared online doc his sister had accidentally left open on the family cloud. I cross-checked names, professions, affiliations. Lawyers, business partners, alumni, donors. People who polished their reputations with pressed suits and tight smiles. I made a spreadsheet color-coded. Then I bought a flash drive. A discreet one. Matte black, no label. I tested it twice to make sure the files loaded clean. Emails. Voicemails. Voice memos. Screenshots from group chats. Each one its own shard of truth. The night before the event, I sat alone at the kitchen table while he was upstairs packing. I drank a glass of wine, not to numb anything, but to mark the moment. I'd been quiet for months. Strategic. Soft. I hadn't raised my voice once. That's what made it powerful. They taught me silence was submission. I taught myself silence could be surveillance. I looked at the dress I'd bought for the occasion, dark teal, high neckline, clean lines. Understated but sharp. It didn't ask to be seen. It dared you not to. When I slipped it on the next evening, I didn't recognize the woman in the mirror. That was the point. The venue was a converted estate. Vineyard views, chandeliers, polished wood floors that echoed with wealth. We arrived just after 6. He held my hand loosely, like someone gripping an umbrella they didn't really need. His mother greeted us with the performative warmth of a politician, 2-cheek kiss, and a compliment that was a correction. You look so muted, dear. That suits you. I smiled. I take after your taste. She didn't flinch. That was the thing with her. Cutting her didn't work unless there was an audience. But tonight there would be one. Dinner unfolded like a theater production. Clinking glasses, curated laughter. The toast schedule printed and passed to each table. I watched it all with the detachment of a stage manager. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't even angry. I was focused. I kept the flash drive in my clutch, next to a folded square of paper with my speaking notes. Not a speech. Just a few reminders. Keywords. Names. Truths. I didn't need theatrics. All I had to do was tell the truth out loud, in front of people who'd spent decades pretending it didn't exist. I didn't need to ruin them. I just needed to reveal them. When dessert was served, mini lemon tarts hand-bruleed, I stood up. Not dramatically. Not even with announcement. I just walked to the mic, gently tapped it once and waited. A few heads turned. My husband looked confused. His mother tilted her head. I smiled. If I could have just 2 minutes, I said, voice clear. I'd like to thank the family. That's all it took. Attention shifted like a tide. I could feel it, the hush, the heat of expectation, the question buried in every glance. What is she going to say? I want to thank you, I began, for teaching me what legacy really means. I paused. You taught me that legacy isn't just the good stories we tell in public. It's the patterns we protect in private. I watched his mother stiffen. You taught me that silence is useful for the person holding the knife. And that cruelty wrapped in tradition still cuts. I saw the first hand tighten around a wine glass. And I realized, maybe that's your way. And that's fine. I reached into my clutch. But I have my way too. I didn't plug in the drive right away. I held it up. Small. Unassuming. This, I said, isn't blackmail. It's not a threat. It's just a mirror. I turned and walked toward the venue projector station. The technician blinked, unsure. I handed him the drive with a note that read, "Play slideshow. No audio. No skipping." He nodded. The lights dimmed. And the silence swelled. On screen, a screenshot of an email from his mother to a cousin, calling me a needy charity case. A recorded voicemail captioned where his father says, "She'll be gone in a year tops. Just smile for now." A photo of a text thread between my husband and his sister. "She makes things awkward. Just keep her out of the group shots." No narration. No commentary. Just facts. Their words, their voices, their legacy. The screen went dark after 5 minutes. Long enough for the message to sink in. When the lights came back, no one moved. No one clapped. And I didn't wait for permission to sit down. The silence after the video wasn't passive. It was panicked. The kind of silence people use when they're scrambling inside, trying to decide if they're supposed to be shocked or furious. No one dared to look at me directly. Not even him. My husband sat frozen, hands in his lap, eyes unfocused like someone trying to wake up from anesthesia. I didn't flinch. I didn't apologize. I took a sip of water, crossed my legs and waited. You learn a lot about people in silence. Who clears their throat? Who looks at the floor? Who checks the exits? His mother did all three. She was the first to speak. Of course she was. "This is a private matter," she said, her voice brittle and sharp-edged like cracked porcelain. "You had no right." Her tone demanded a response, but I offered none. She looked at my husband, her face twitching into its practiced mask of injured dignity. "Are you just going to sit there?" she hissed. He blinked slow. His voice came out soft, dazed. "I didn't know. That was all. Not I'm sorry. Not this is wrong. Just I didn't know." I felt the sting of that more than anything else that night. Not because it wasn't true, but because he said it like it made him innocent. "You didn't know?" I repeated, loud enough for the table to hear. I turned to face him. "You didn't know she called me a parasite in an email you were copied on?" A ripple of movement passed through the guests, gasps, shifting chairs, someone whispering Jesus Christ. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. That was his way, wordless retreat. Always too late. Always too little. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I kept my tone flat and clean, like a scalpel. "You didn't know they've been dissecting me behind closed doors since our engagement? That they made bets on when I'd leave you?" Silence again. Not even the sound of a fork. His father stood next. Slow, stiff, jaw clenched. "You embarrassed this family," he said, pointing a thick finger at me like I was some unruly waitress who dropped a tray. "You could have come to us like an adult. You didn't need to perform." I smiled at him, a small, polite thing. "I did come to you. I asked for space at the table. I asked to be treated like a human being. And every time I spoke, you all acted like I'd ruined the mood." I paused, leaning forward slightly. So I stopped speaking. I started collecting. I could feel the blood rising in his face, a furious flush climbing from collar to cheekbone. The air in the room turned heavy, full of shame and scrutiny. Guests began exchanging glances, some of them rising slowly, murmuring fake excuses. Bathroom, fresh air, emergency call. No one looked me in the eye as they passed. But no one looked at his parents either. That was the win. That was the crack. Not just embarrassment, but doubt. The kind that leaks slow and permanent into reputations like water through drywall. I hadn't screamed. I hadn't even raised my hand. I'd just pointed at the rot they'd tried so hard to paint over. And that was enough to make the room unsteady. My husband finally spoke. Voice low, almost a whisper. "You planned this." He looked at me like I'd become someone else. Maybe I had. Maybe I'd finally become the version of myself that didn't need to beg for decency. "Yes," I said. "I planned it after your third shrug. After your second apology for their behavior. After I realized I was sleeping next to someone who'd rather keep peace with cowards than stand next to me. I watched him deflate under the weight of that. He looked like he wanted to argue, but he didn't, because we both knew he couldn't. His mother sat down, hands shaking. "We welcomed you." Her voice cracked on the word welcomed, like she couldn't quite swallow it. "You misunderstood. We have traditions." I stared at her. Exclusion isn't a tradition. It's a choice. So was humiliation. So was silence. And so was letting your son marry someone you planned to quietly erase. She looked away, blinking hard, as if that would stop her eyes from burning. She still hadn't realized this wasn't about changing their minds. It was about ending my participation in their performance. I didn't want an apology. I wanted the lights on. I wanted them seen. "I'm not staying for dessert," I said, pushing back my chair slowly. "But don't worry. I already sent the footage to a few friends of the family, just in case the drive gets lost." The moment I stood, the tension snapped. A cousin dropped his napkin. A wine glass tipped. But I didn't wait for the reactions. I turned my back to the table, finally, and walked toward the exit, each step quieter than the last. No one followed. Not even him. Especially not him. That told me everything I needed to know. About them. About him. About the silence I'd survived long enough to make into a weapon. Outside, the air felt clean, like rinsed metal. I looked up at the moon and thought, not about revenge. Not really. I thought about precision. About how carefully I'd waited, measured, listened. How I hadn't struck until it mattered. They taught me how to disappear. I taught myself how to arrive. I didn't check my phone until the next morning. It was still on Do Not Disturb from the night before. I left it face down on the nightstand while I lay in bed and watched the morning light crawl across the ceiling of the hotel room I'd booked, solo. No one knew I was there. I'd made the reservation under my maiden name. It was a small, quiet place on the edge of town, just far enough from the chaos, just close enough to hear the echo. When I finally turned the phone over, there were 13 missed calls, 9 voicemails, and more texts than I cared to count. I read none of them. I didn't need to. I already knew the script. I walked to a nearby cafe in sunglasses and a hoodie, took a table in the back near a dusty bookshelf, and ordered black coffee and a slice of blood orange tart. The woman behind the counter complimented my earrings. I thanked her. No one else knew who I was. No one stared. No one whispered. It was the first time in a long time I felt like a person instead of a project. I turned my phone off completely and slid it into my bag. The silence wasn't frightening anymore. It felt earned. Like a cleared space, like something I'd carved out with bare hands and an unbreaking will. The fallout didn't come as a scream. It came as a ripple. A cousin emailed me later that week. Not to defend, not to scold, but to confess. "I always thought something was off," she wrote. "They treated you like a ghost and called it tradition. I'm sorry I didn't say anything." Others followed. Quiet messages. Subtle acknowledgments. One sent a donation receipt from a domestic violence charity with a note. "In your name for the quiet ones who fought back." I didn't reply to most. Not because I wasn't grateful, but because I didn't need validation. I hadn't done it to be believed. I'd done it to be done. My husband came home to an empty house. I know because he texted me a photo of the bedroom. The closet half empty. The drawers neat. My wedding ring placed on top of a printed photo. The one from that first family vacation, where I was cropped at the edge. He didn't say anything in the message. Just sent the photo. I stared at it for a long time. I thought I might feel guilt. But there was only stillness. Not peace yet, not quite. But stillness. Like standing at the edge of a field you just set on fire. Nothing left to burn. Just ash and air. He emailed me later, longer this time. Said he didn't know how deep it went. Said he should have defended me. Said he thought keeping things calm was the same as being kind. I almost replied. I drafted 3 different versions. One that forgave. One that explained. One that asked him why it took a public unraveling to open his eyes. But I never hit send. Because the real truth was this. I didn't want him back. I didn't want anything back. I wanted forward. I wanted clean. I wanted the version of myself I'd become in the silence. The one who no longer negotiated her own dignity. His mother, of course, tried to save face. She posted a long self-pitying message online a week later about family betrayal and private matters made public, never naming me but alluding in every line. The comments split down the middle. Some offered sympathy. Others asked questions. I watched the thread grow from the sidelines. I never engaged. That was the real poison in all this. The not knowing. The silence from me was louder than anything I could have said. And she knew it. Because for once she didn't control the narrative. I did. And my choice was absence. One by one, her connections began to peel away. The board of a charity she chaired issued a quiet statement of concern. A few old friends unfollowed. Her garden party invitations went unanswered. Not because of scandal, but because discomfort clings. People don't like to get too close to something that might remind them of their own silence. She'd built a world out of soft cruelty and social armor. And now, every smile she offered carried the suspicion of a concealed knife. She'd made a career out of shame, but never imagined what it would feel like turned inward. I wasn't watching out of vengeance. I wasn't tallying their collapse. I just wanted to understand the scale of the damage they called tradition, the number of people who had been made small. I started receiving messages from distant connections. Women who'd married into similar families. Men who'd been made complicit by comfort. One woman wrote, "You gave me language. I thought I was just sensitive, but now I know they were just careful." I saved that one. Not for ego. For proof. That this wasn't just a personal reckoning. It was generational. Eventually I moved. A small apartment near the water. Quiet neighbors. A bookstore down the street. I changed my name legally, not to disappear but to reclaim. The name I chose was a family name. One from a grandmother who survived more than I could fathom. I told no one. Not because I was hiding, but because I didn't owe anyone access to the life I'd rebuilt. Let them guess where I'd gone. Let them choke on the silence I once swallowed for them. I wasn't running. I was resting. I wasn't retreating. I was arriving. I didn't hate him. That was the strangest part. I tried. I waited for that hate to bloom in me thick and poisonous, something I could aim. But it never came. What came instead was the dull ache of recognition. That he was never cruel, not directly. He was careful, measured, emotionally polite. But he was absent. Not physically. Emotionally. Morally. Spiritually. He stood beside me for 3 years while his family chipped away at me. And every time I looked at him for help, I found his eyes cast down and his hands at his sides. That wasn't love. That was cowardice in a tailored suit. He asked to meet weeks later. Neutral ground. A cafe I used to love. I chose a different one. One I'd never been to with him. I made that choice deliberately. No ghosts. No overlap. He looked tired. Paler than I remembered. Like someone whose sleep had turned against him. He didn't reach for a hug. He just sat down and said my name once. Soft. Like he was afraid it might crack in his mouth. I let the silence stretch. I watched him squirm in it. Because that's what he'd never learned. How silence feels when it isn't protective. When it's heavy. When it asks questions without offering an escape route. I didn't know what to say, he told me. They've always been that way. I didn't realize how deep it cut you. I stirred my coffee slowly. They didn't cut me. I said, eyes still down. You did. With your silence. Every time you let them have the last word. Every time you left the room instead of standing beside me. You didn't throw the stones. But you held the door open so they could aim better. He looked like he might cry. But I wasn't interested in his tears. Not anymore. Grief is private. And his grief came too late to mean anything. He told me he missed me. That I'd changed. That I wasn't like this when we met. I smiled at that. No, I said. I was like this. I was this strong. I was this clear. But you liked me better when I was smaller, didn't you? Easier to defend in theory, not in practice. He tried to interrupt, but I raised a hand and he stopped. You didn't marry me because I was loud, I said. You married me because I was willing to lower my voice in a room full of your family. Because I laughed off insults. Because I swallowed discomfort and called it compromise. He apologized. Of course he did. It was a soft, shapeless thing, barely audible above the cafe noise. I nodded. I didn't say, I forgive you. I didn't need to. Forgiveness isn't always a door swinging open. Sometimes it's just walking away without looking back. I could see it in his eyes, that flicker of hope that this meeting was the start of something redemptive. But I wasn't here for that. I was here to give him a mirror and leave him alone with it. I'd carried his reflection in my mind for too long. It was time he stared into it on his own. Before I left, he asked if I'd ever loved him, and I didn't answer for a long time. I looked out the window at the traffic light blinking red, the people crossing without looking, the world moving forward like it always does after someone's heart breaks. Then I said, yes, I did. But love without protection isn't love. It's exposure. He opened his mouth again, but I was already rising from my seat. I didn't need the last word. I'd taken the last truth, and that was enough. When I walked out, I didn't look back. Not because I was angry, but because I was done. I think that's what hurt him the most. Not the video, not the public fallout, not the silence I left behind, but the fact that I didn't want to fight anymore. That I didn't think he was worth the battle. When someone stops begging to be seen, it means they've already found a place where their reflection isn't distorted. And that kind of peace doesn't come from reconciliation. It comes from resurrection, from clawing your way out of someone else's comfort, and planting yourself in your own dignity. I didn't leave him for revenge. I left him because I finally understood that he'd never throw the match, but he'd always watch the fire. I left the cafe lighter than I arrived. Not joyful. Not free. Just intact. I walked the long way home, letting the wind whip at my coat, letting the silence trail behind me like a cloak. He'd tell his own version of the story. They all would. I knew that, and I didn't care. Let them call it betrayal. Let them call it drama. I knew what it really was. A reckoning. An ending. A door shut by my own hand. Not slammed. Not screamed through. Just quietly closed. Locked. And on the other side, something new taking shape. Something he would never get to see. I stopped waiting for closure the way you stop waiting for a letter that never arrives. One morning I just stopped checking the mailbox. The urge didn't disappear overnight, but it dulled. Softened. It stopped feeling like hunger and started feeling like choice. I woke up in my new apartment to birds instead of alarms, to space instead of demands. The walls were blank, waiting. I didn't rush to fill them. I learned to live with the quiet not as a punishment, but as proof that I had finally chosen myself, without needing to explain why. I found my own routines again. Slow ones. Sacred ones. I lit candles in the morning, even when the sun was already bright. I cooked for one and plated the food beautifully, not because anyone was watching but because I was. I left my phone on airplane mode more days than not. I read poetry out loud to the walls, to the plants, to myself. And for the first time in years my voice didn't tremble. I didn't have to prove anything. I didn't have to make a case for my own existence. I just breathed. And breathing unjudged became its own kind of ceremony. I never told the full story to anyone. Not all at once. Not even in therapy. I gave pieces, threads, glimpses. But the full tapestry stayed with me. Because what happened wasn't just theirs. It was mine. It lived in the way I checked for exits in crowded rooms. In the way I stopped over-explaining when someone didn't understand me. In the way I started looking women in the eye. Especially the quiet ones, the ones shrinking themselves to keep peace. I started offering them space. Not advice. Just space. Sometimes that's all we need. A place to be unafraid of our own volume. Months passed. Then seasons. Their lives went on too. I watched it from a distance when I felt strong enough. A tagged photo here. A changed last name there. His mother's public smiles grew wider, more desperate. She'd learned not to speak my name anymore. Not even to vilify it. Because to name me would be to admit I'd mattered. And that was the deepest wound I'd left behind. Not scandal, not reputation loss, but the reality that I'd walked away untouched, unbegging, unbroken. She built a world where people begged for scraps of acceptance. And I was the one who stood up mid-meal and said, I'm not hungry anymore. Eventually, I found love again, but not the romantic kind. Not yet. I fell in love with solitude, with sovereignty, with the subtle way healing doesn't announce itself. It just shows up in the mirror one morning, when you no longer brace for the worst. I planted a garden on my balcony. Nothing fancy, just lavender, thyme, Some wild strawberries that never grew quite right but smelled like home. I started keeping a journal again, not for documenting pain, but for celebrating presence. A list of things I noticed. The sound of rain on metal, the way dusk turned the sky violet, the silence of my own approval. I didn't tell him where I lived. He never asked. That felt like its own kind of answer. I imagined him, sometimes trying to explain the story to someone new, wondering which parts he had permission to tell. Because the version that made him innocent didn't exist anymore. Not because I ruined it, but because I refused to maintain it for him. That's the difference between burning bridges and walking away. One seeks revenge. The other seeks rest. I didn't need them to suffer. I just needed them to feel the absence of someone who no longer made herself small to stay. And that's what they felt, absence. Not just mine, but the absence of obedience. The absence of a scapegoat. The absence of someone to absorb their discomfort. I imagine family dinners now with a new target, a new silence. I don't feel sorry for her. Not anymore. I hope she leaves sooner than I did. I hope she hears herself the first time she starts to vanish. I hope she has anyone who says you don't have to stay small for them to be comfortable. And if she doesn't, I hope she finds her own way out. Because once you leave, you never forget the map. I kept that flash drive in a drawer for a long time. Not because I needed it anymore, but because it reminded me of something crucial. That survival can be graceful. That justice doesn't always wear teeth. Sometimes it's a woman in a dark teal dress standing up with a microphone and saying, "Enough." I threw it away one rainy morning after dusting the drawer.
No ceremony. No goodbye.
Just release. Because I no longer needed to prove what happened. The life I was living proved it for me. I said once perfect. I have my own way too. And I did. It wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. But it was unshakable. It was built from the kind of silence that sees everything, the kind that waits until it's ready, the kind that no longer asks permission. I didn't just survive them. I outgrew them. I turned the exile into a doorway. I walked through it. And on the other side, I didn't find revenge. I found peace. If this story hit something deep, if you've ever been the one left out, talked over, or made to feel small, don't scroll past. Drop a comment. Tell your story. Hit like and subscribe if you want more endings where the quiet ones finally win. And share this with someone who needs to be reminded. You don't have to stay where you're not seen. See you soon in our next story.